They called it the Watcher of Rotherwell, a relic the sea should have kept. When the storm unearthed it from the cliffs, locals gathered to watch as the tides clawed at its feet, whispering through the hollow stone. The priests sealed it away, claiming its voice brought sickness, but time turned that warning into folklore. Now, centuries later, the statue sits beneath glass at Blackmere Abbey Museum, its surface gray as bone, its features shifting with every flicker of candlelight. Last winter, a teenage boy dared his friends to spend a night inside. By morning, his body was found before the case, his eyes wide, his lips parted as though answering someone who had called his name. The cameras failed that night. Only a single tape remained, filled with wind, and beneath it, a breath that didn't belong to the living. By sunrise, the boy's death had already joined the Abbey's long ledger of tragedies. Locals muttered about the curse, but officials called it exposure, a tragic accident. Yet those who had stood near the glass that night told another story, that the air had changed, heavy as breath on skin, and that every candle in the nave had extinguished at once. They said they heard a sound, not quite human, low and deliberate, forming a single word. No one admitted what they heard, only that it was familiar. When Dr. Vance arrived, she insisted on evidence. But as she replayed a recovered tape in her office, something impossible emerged beneath the wind. The faint articulation of her own name, spoken as though the voice had been waiting centuries for her to listen. News spread through Rotherwell faster than the tide. Fishermen refused to cast near the cliffs. The priest refused to ring the abbey bell. The local paper ran a single photograph of the watcher, cropped tight around its featureless face, captioned only, "It speaks." At night, Eleanor sat before the sealed display, candle trembling in her hand, replaying the recording in her hand over and over. Each time the voice seemed closer, reshaped by memory and fear. The human mind, she told herself, could find meaning in static, syllables in wind. Yet, the last time she listened, the voice didn't just whisper her name. It said, "Look behind you." Father McCrae claimed the watcher was carved by monks from stone that breathed. They said the rock sang when struck, hollow, resonant, as though alive. During the Black Plague, the abbey sealed it in the crypt, branding it an idol of blasphemy. But stories outlast stones. For generations, each caretaker of the relic reported hearing faint murmurs echo through the chapel walls. Most dismissed them. A few vanished. McCreed had spent 40 years refusing to listen. Now, facing the deaths and the unearthed statue, he feared that silence had finally spoken back. That night, the abbey closed its doors, but inside, faint clicks from the recorder persisted. Eleanor had left it running beside the glass case. The tape hissed, the reels turning on their own, capturing only the low hum of air through the corridors. Hours passed before the tape ended. When she returned at dawn, the reels had reversed themselves, playing backward. And from the distorted reverse, hiss came one unmistakable syllable, drawn out like a sigh from deep stone lungs. Her name. When Dr. Vance announced her plan to record the watcher's voice, the museum board called it madness, but curiosity always wins against fear. She contacted an acoustics specialist from Glasgow, Callum Boyd, to document the statue's resonance. By the time he arrived, winter had swallowed the town, and the abbey's halls groaned beneath the cold. Together they set up microphones around the statue, tracing cables like veins across the stone floor. Callum laughed at her superstition. She smiled at his ignorance. That first night, their equipment hummed quietly in the dark. Then, without warning, every channel spiked at once, a low moan vibrating through the limestone. When they replayed it, they heard not wind, but something forming syllables too deliberate for nature. Eleanor insisted the sound was caused by air compression. Callum disagreed. He believed it was a frequency outside normal human range, a pattern too consistent to be random. He spent hours isolating each spike, layering them into what sounded like fragmented speech. She listened from across the room, refusing to admit the rhythm resembled a name. The audio swelled and faded like the sea, each wave drawing closer, more articulate. When Callum finally filtered the static, he froze. For a heartbeat, both heard the same thing. A whisper rising from the lowest register to the breath of a human voice, repeating softly, "Callum." The following morning, the museum's janitor refused to enter the main hall, claiming he'd heard his own name whispered from the vents. By noon, the rumor had spread through Rotherwell like infection. Shopkeepers turned off radios, parents forbade children from walking near the cliffs. Eleanor studied the waveform on Callum's screen, every spike shaped like a heartbeat. Father McRae demanded they stop, that the experiment itself had invited judgment. But Eleanor was transfixed. She wanted to understand what language the stone spoke, and why it only called those who came too close. That night, the Abbey's power failed again. Callum stayed behind, setting up new microphones, his recorder lights pulsing red in the dark. He hummed softly to keep calm. But the echo came back a split second too late, a mimicry rather than reflection. The air thickened, as if holding breath. He turned, scanning the room, and saw nothing but the statue's silhouette gleaming faintly through the glass. Then came the whisper, so close it could have been inside his skull. He tore off his headphones. Silence followed, heavy and wet, like the pause before tide retreats. Eleanor found him at dawn, pale, trembling, unable to explain what he'd heard. His audio file was corrupted, only static and deep resonance like a human inhale reversed. Yet, amid the noise, one phrase repeated faintly. "He listens." Father McRae demanded the statue be resealed in the crypt, but Eleanor refused, insisting on one more test. She believed she could predict the frequency before it spoke, capture the voice before it formed her name. The priest turned away, muttering that no one could silence something carved to remember death. The museum's archives were older than the abbey itself, carved deep into the cliffside long before Christianity reached these shores. Eleanor descended nightly, searching for any record of the Watcher's origin. Dust coated her hands like ash as she turned brittle pages written in a monk's trembling script. Each entry repeated a single refrain. It spoke the names of those who forgot to pray. Every curator before her had annotated the same lines, each handwriting more frantic, each ending abruptly mid-sentence. When she found the final record dated 1912, the ink had bled from water damage, but one phrase remained legible. It whispered Eleanor. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to fear coincidence or prophecy. Father McRae brought her a bundle of photographs from the 1890s. The first excavation of the Watcher. Every person in those photos had died within months of exposure. He told her of Brother Alaric, the monk who claimed to have heard God through the stone before being found silent and rigid at the altar, his lungs filled with sand. The priest's hands trembled as he spoke, the rosary clinking against the table like clockwork. Eleanor listened, torn between skepticism and an unspoken dread that had begun to shape her dreams. Dreams where her own voice echoed back from hollow stone, begging her to listen. Callum refused to return to the recording hall. He spent his days cataloging files, avoiding eye contact, his headphones dangling useless around his neck. Yet at night, he heard it again, his own voice calling his name from somewhere inside the tapes. He tried erasing the recordings, but each deletion spawned another copy. When he confronted Eleanor, she told him there must be a technical loop, a feedback echo. But when they played the files together, both heard it distinctly. Two voices this time, alternating between their names in perfect unison, breathing as one. In her insomnia, Eleanor began documenting her thoughts aloud, treating the whispers as data. She noted their intervals, tone, and direction, always originating near the statue's chest cavity. She recorded for 6 hours straight, then played back the tape. For the first 5 hours, nothing but stat. At the 6th, the sound of movement, footsteps on stone, matching her own pacing, followed by her voice whispering in time delay. "You shouldn't have listened." She stopped breathing until the sound faded. Then, faintly, the tape caught a second breath. Not hers. By the end of the week, Eleanor had stopped sleeping. Visitors claimed they could hear a woman's voice humming faintly through the abbey vents, though the halls were empty. Father McCrae begged her to leave, but she couldn't. The recordings had begun changing tone, forming sentences she hadn't spoken. Each message ended with the same command: look closer. When she finally replayed her earliest tape, she heard something she had missed before. Beneath the static, the faint sound of her own handwriting scraping across the page. Long before she'd started recording, the storm that had once revealed the Watcher returned with renewed vengeance, hammering the cliffs as if reclaiming what had been unearthed. Father McCrae, driven by guilt, confessed the abbey's final secret. The statue had not been carved, it had formed. In 1347, a monk named Brother Alaric claimed to hear the voice of God emanating from the cliffside. He prayed for days without food or sleep until his body hardened where he knelt. When the others found him, his flesh was stone, his lips open in perpetual chant. The Watcher's surface still bore faint traces of his robe. Eleanor listened, her pen motionless. The priest's voice shook when he admitted the monks hadn't buried the effigy. They built their abbey around it. The legend claimed Brother Alaric's spirit lingered in the stone, neither saved nor damned, cursed to repeat the names of those who dared seek the divine voice. McCrae brought her to the crypt's foundation, where the air turned cold and metallic. Eleanor's recorder picked up frequencies below human hearing, rising like a heartbeat. In the silence between pulses, the sound formed syllables, not Latin, not any known tongue. Yet the cadence mirrored prayer. McCrae whispered that those words translated roughly to, "Remember me in silence." When she looked at him, his eyes glistened with something close to resignation. Callum's nerves deteriorated into near delirium. He confessed hearing chanting when the wind rose, voices calling him by name in layered whispers. Eleanor, determined to disprove it, played his latest recording aloud. The sound was unmistakable. A chorus repeating his name, then hers, alternating in rhythm like breath shared between two mouths. He fled into the storm before dawn, babbling that the sea was singing his name. McCrae crossed himself, murmuring that once the voice claimed you, there was no return to silence. The next day, they found Callum's equipment washed ashore, the microphone cable leading back toward the abbey's drainage tunnel. By the time they dragged the drainage tunnel, the tide had turned. Callum's recorder was found lodged in the grating, still running. Eleanor pressed play. The tape hissed, then a wet, dragging sound filled the hall, like breath drawn through water. Then came a single word, soft and deliberate. "Eleanor." The priest sank to his knees. He begged her to end it, to seal the statue again before the voice found more names to claim. But Eleanor's fascination had twisted into conviction. She believed the voice wasn't malevolent, merely misunderstood. She promised to prove it by capturing its final phrase. That night, thunder rolled across the cliffs as Eleanor descended into the hall alone. McCrae had locked himself in the chapel to pray. She placed microphones in a perfect circle around the Watcher and started recording. Lightning illuminated its surface, and for the first time she saw the faint imprint of a human face within the stone, eyes closed as if in torment. The voice came softly, rhythmic with her breath. It spoke one sentence before the power failed, plunging the abbey into blackness. Only her recorder continued running, the tape turning steadily as the whisper said, "You were always part of me." By morning, Eleanor's recorder held 6 continuous hours of sound. She played it in her office as rain lashed the window. At first, only static, then breathing, slow and rhythmic, as though matching her pulse. The waveform rose into distinct syllables. "He listens," she remembers. "I remain." Her rational mind struggled against belief, but something inside her felt an eerie recognition, as if the words were drawn from her own subconscious. Each time she replayed it, the voice grew clearer, now whispering her name between lines. Father McCrae refused to hear it again. He said it was not a recording. It was an invitation. Father McCrae searched the archives again, desperate for absolution. He discovered a final Latin verse in Brother Alaric's manuscript, a plea written before his petrification. "I called to heaven and found only my own echo." McCrae wept as he read, realizing the monks had mistaken madness for revelation. But when he returned to the hall, Eleanor was already standing before the statue, its glass cover removed, her voice low, as she repeated the ancient lines. He shouted for her to stop. The air grew heavy, and the whisper answered, overlapping her voice, a duet of prayer and lament. When the lights failed again, the voice filled every corridor of Blackmere Abbey, no longer whispering, but breathing, resonating through stone and air alike. Eleanor clutched her recorder as if it were a relic of faith. McCrae collapsed at the altar, shouting prayers drowned by the rising hum. From the open glass case, the watcher exhaled a visible mist that curled toward Eleanor's face. She stood motionless, lips parted, letting the fog touch her skin. Then, faintly, she smiled. Not in fear, but recognition. Outside, the storm ceased as abruptly as it began. Within the abbey, silence settled like snowfall. Eleanor played back the final recording, her own voice whispering calm words she didn't remember saying. "It's all right now." But beneath it, another sound emerged, breathing that continued long after she'd stopped speaking. McCrae, trembling, reached toward the recorder. The reels stopped spinning, though the breathing persisted in the air around them. Then came the faintest rustle, like fingers brushing stone, followed by a voice neither male nor female, whispering from nowhere. "One more to remember." By dawn, Eleanor had sealed the hall and ordered the museum closed. Yet her notes changed overnight, written in a script not her own, describing events she had not witnessed. Each page ended with the same phrase: "The stone remembers your voice." She burned her research in the courtyard as McCrae watched from the window, unable to intervene. The flames hissed and crackled, echoing faint whispers rising from the ashes. For a moment, he thought he heard his own name carried on the wind. Then, as the smoke cleared, the watcher's reflection appeared faintly in the window pane, its mouth slightly open, as if inhaling. The town had grown silent. Fishermen claimed the sea no longer made sound against the rocks. Even the gulls had vanished. Inside the abbey, Eleanor remained alone, pacing the hall where the statue once stood. She spoke less now, choosing instead to listen. And McCrae visited only once more, pleading for her to leave, before the relic's voice claimed her completely. She smiled faintly, saying she had already recorded proof. The sound of life continuing through stone. As he turned away, she whispered that she understood now. The whispers weren't warnings. They were invitations to remember. The last thing he heard as he closed the door was her voice, soft and measured, asking the silence to speak again. Eleanor set up her final experiment, microphones surrounding the pedestal where the watcher had rested. She wanted to prove that the whispers didn't come from the statue, but from the air itself, reverberating like memory through the stones. At midnight, she pressed record. The reels turned smoothly, No sound at first but her breathing. Then, a low tone emerged, almost like wind between walls. It deepened, becoming a harmonic resonance that vibrated the floor. Eleanor whispered her own name into the microphone. The tone replied in kind, same pitch, same cadence, as if the air itself had learned her voice. Father McCrae returned at dawn, drawn by instinct rather than faith. The abbey's doors hung open. The corridors echoed faintly with the hum of electricity. He followed the sound into the hall and found her recorder still spinning. Her coat lay folded on the bench, her glasses neatly placed beside it. The pedestal stood empty, yet the air shimmered faintly above it, as if something invisible exhaled. He pressed his ear to the recorder, and beneath the hiss, heard her voice. Calm, distant, layered with another whisper overlapping it, repeating, "We remember." He carried the recorder to the chapel, trembling as the tape played on. The whispers rose and fell like a hymn. In the background, footsteps echoed that were not his. Each time the voice said her name, the chapel lights dimmed. Then the voice changed, deepened, no longer hers but something older, layered, and immense. It spoke words in a forgotten rhythm, vibrating the crucifix on the wall. The priest fell to his knees, clutching his cross. The last phrase was clear. "Now you will listen too." Then silence, the kind that feels like breath drawn before speech. When the museum reopened weeks later, Eleanor's name had been added to the Abbey's memorial plaque. The hall was restored to its original design, her equipment removed, her office empty. Yet every night after closing, the security cameras recorded faint distortions. A figure moving past the empty pedestal, a voice beneath the static saying, "Be still." Father McCrae resigned, leaving the abbey in silence. But visitors still reported hearing something faint when they leaned close to the stone base. A breath, a sigh, sometimes a whisper that sounded exactly like their own name, spoken with Eleanor's calm, patient voice. Months passed before Detective Isla Kerr was assigned to close the Blackmere Abbey case. Official reports listed Eleanor's death as undetermined, though no body had ever been recovered. Kerr arrived at dusk, the sky bruised violet, rain beginning to fall. She'd read the transcripts, every note, every rumor, but hearing them in the empty corridors made them feel less like records and more like echoes. The abbey was colder than she expected, her breath fogged before her face. Somewhere within the silence, a faint whir of machinery still played. Following the sound, she found an old recorder spinning endlessly. The tape hissed like breathing, and beneath that, faintly, she thought she heard her own name. The recording was dated the night Eleanor vanished. Kerr replayed it, leaning close to the speaker. At first, static, then the whisper began. Layered voices, familiar and foreign, calling her by name as though welcoming her. She tried to turn it off, but the button jammed, the tape continuing on its own. Behind the whispers came something new. The rhythmic pulse of a heartbeat not hers, slow and deliberate, filling the air around her. When she finally ripped the power cord from the wall, the sound didn't stop. It was everywhere now, woven into the stone itself. The whisper grew louder. Kerr stumbled backward, flashlight scattering light across the walls where faint handprints appeared in dust. Dozens of them, pressed from within. She called out, her voice trembling, echoing once, then again, slightly delayed. The second echo formed words she hadn't spoken. "I hear you." She froze, mouth dry, realizing she had repeated Eleanor's final words from the log. The recorder clicked as the tape reached its end. Then, against all reason, the reels reversed, spinning backward, pulling her breath into their rhythm. The final recording recovered from that night begins with heavy breathing and the scrape of shoes on stone. Then Kerr's voice, calm, distant, whispering, "I understand. After that, silence. Investigators who listened claimed to hear something beneath the quiet. Not words, but the faint sound of two voices breathing in unison. When analyzed, the waveform revealed an impossible pattern. Two identical signatures, one belonging to Eleanor Vance, the other to Isla Kerr, overlapping perfectly in time. The experts dismissed it as artifact distortion. The locals called it what they always had: the Watcher's remembrance. Black Mere Abbey is silent once more. The museum reopened under new management, its halls polished, its relics labeled, its past rewritten. Tourists visit on weekends, photographing the pedestal where the Watcher once stood. But when dusk falls and the air grows cold, the staff swear they can hear faint murmuring, names whispered softly through the vents. Some say the statue still stands, buried deep beneath the abbey, waiting for the next storm to unearth it. Others claim it was never a statue at all, only the echo of those who listened too closely. On quiet nights when the tide recedes, the wind carries a single phrase along the cliffs. The stone remembers.